Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is part three of chapter one, where we're going to review um, system interactions and evolution as themes of biology. So, one of the themes of biology is that from molecules to ecosystems, it doesn't matter along the hierarchy, there are always going to be interactions. And these interactions are important in biological systems. These interactions occur on the molecular level and they occur on the global level. So interactions between different components of the systems, between different levels of the systems, are all very important. So interactions that occur between components that make up a living organisms. You have cells that are interacting, molecules interacting. Um, the cells create tissues, which interact with other tissues, and then tissues create organs, which organs interact with each other as well. These interactions are important and necessary for biological function. As the organisms get more complicated and more complex, it is important that they do interact with each other. And a lot of biological processes can self regulate through a mechanism called feedback. Now, there are two different kinds of feedback. Some are positive, some are negative. The most common form of feedback is negative feedback, in where that the response reduces the initial stimulus. So, the positive feedback is also happens, but it's less common in nature. So let me give you an example of a negative feedback, which I use this example all the time. It is blood glucose and insulin. So as high blood glucose levels increase, it will trigger or stimulate the pancreas to secrete insulin. So insulin will circulate throughout the body, and then insulin binds to the body cells, which cause them to be able to take up the glucose that is in the blood. And so, as they are taking in the glucose, it causes your blood sugar to drop back down to normal levels. And this happens every time you eat. This happens within the body. You're eating food. It's converted to glucose. It travels throughout your bloodstream, and then your cells take in that glucose and uses it for energy. So this is a form of negative feedback in that as the glucose levels drop, as they decrease, so does the release of insulin. So it's a negative feedback. Um, but organisms don't just, so when we think of biology, it's not just at the molecular level, it's at the ecosystem level as well. Organisms will interact with other organisms and with their environment. So it's very common for organisms to interact with others if, and in many cases that means consuming or preying on um, other organisms. So you will have herbivores who will come along and want to eat plants, and then you'll have consumers that will come along and want to eat those um, herbivores. Organisms are continuously interacting with their environment, and the environment is affected by the organisms that live there. For example, plants will shape um, the types of environments that they are able to grow in. This pine savanna here showing is that, it's mainly covered with a lot of grasses and shrubs, not as many trees. But if it was capable of housing lots of trees, it would. And so the types of plants that are in an environment many times will influence the types of animals that are in an environment. And so this diagram is just showing you all the interactions that can occur between the organisms in this ecosystem. The plants will obtain energy from sunlight. Um, the leaves can fall to the ground, which get used by the decomposers in the soil, like fungi, for example. The tree is able to take up water, the plants take up water and energy from the soil. And then animals can eat the plants, and then the cycle can repeat as well. So everything is always interacting with everything in the environment. uh, which that includes humans. Humans interact with the environment at all times. We as humans love to change our environments or to have a control over our environments. And especially over the past 150 years, humans have been burning a lot of fossil fuels and releasing greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Regardless of um, the argument or not, the result is the same in that our climate is changing on the planet. Global warming is happening. And this change in climate is changing our wind and precipitation patterns. We're experiencing more severe weather events, such as storms and droughts. Like currently, right now, we are experiencing hurricanes on the West Coast, uh, large high pressure system in the middle of the country where temperatures are soaring to over 100s um, for days to on weeks. Habitats are being destroyed constantly, either by construction or fire or deforestation. And so the plants and animals are having to change and shift based on all these disturbances. And for many cases, there's insufficient habitat for species to live. So a lot of populations of species are decreasing in size, and in many cases, they are disappearing. For example, like this lizard here. So while climate change is drastic and it unfortunately will affect um, all life on the planet, including humans as well, um, this next core theme of biology is evolution, which accounts for the unity and diversity of life. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that while there will be a lot of detrimental effects on the planet, um, life will have the ability to adapt to these situations. So, understanding evolution helps us make sense of everything that we know about life. And the scientific explanation for all the diversity that we see on the planet, how things are related to each other, is through evolution. So, evolution is the concept that living organisms are modified descendants of common ancestors. There's an abundance of evidence that supports the occurrence of evolution. And so I love this quote: nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So for life on the planet, it's very diverse. Approximately 1.8 million species have been identified and named to date. I'll let you guys know around 450,000 of those are plants alone. Each species is given what we call a two-part name, just like, for most of us, we have a two-part name. The genus and the species, which the species belongs, and then the specific species name, which is unique to that species. For example, for humans, we are the Homo sapiens. Homo representing the genus, and which is the thinking man. That's what Homo represents. And then sapiens means sentient. So Homo sapiens is the name of our species. There are other species of hominids, which are the types of species in the Homo genus. But there are a lot of different genera, different gena, the plural form of genus, that exist on the planet. So there are estimates of the total number of species that actually exist, and they range from 10 million to over 100 million species. I think 10 million, personally, I think 10 million is a conservative number. I think it's much, much larger. And the reason for that, and why a lot of people do believe there's a lot more species, is because there is a microscopic world that exists that a lot of people do not study, and there are uh, millions of species that are not named. There are millions of bacteria, archaea, single-celled organisms that live on this planet that are not named or haven't been discovered. And just because we just haven't had the time or the people dedicated who study in those areas to find those species and name them. But what we do know is that in our current classification of the species on the planet is that there are three domains of life. And currently they're divided into the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. So bacteria and archaea are the prokaryotic genera, and the eukarya is the eukaryotic genera. Domain eukarya includes all eukaryotic organisms. They're the ones that everyone are familiar with. Eukarya are divided into four kingdoms: plants, fungi, animals, and protists. So a plant is classified as anything that's able to produce its own food by photosynthesis. Fungi are able to absorb nutrients, and animals ingest or engulf their food to get nutrients. Protist is a fourth kingdom that exists, and a protist is kind of like a mixed bag of it's a little bit of everything. It's all microscopic organisms that are eukaryotic, um, and they're very numerous and diverse, um, but they don't readily fit into just one of the groups. So currently now protists are what we call an amalgamation of all these less closely related organisms, but some of them appear to be plant related, some of them are animal related, some of them are fungi related, but they're just a little bit different. And so we just keep them as one kingdom. So these are the three domains: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya, with the four kingdoms: kingdom plantae, kingdom fungi, kingdom animalia, and then the protists. So there is unity in the diversity of life. How do we know this? So there's a diversity in life, but we know that there's a unity based on our DNA. DNA is the universal genetic language. It's common to all organisms, and all organisms on the planet do share some common DNA elements, which means that at some point in our evolutionary history, we're all related from a common ancestor. The history of life is documented in our fossils. It's documented in our soils. Um, there is a lot of evidence to show the changing um, Earth and the species that occupied the planet for billions of years. So this is just an example showing you how there is a um, evolutionary common ancestor between, like, for example, a paramecium and a human. So while a paramecium and a human are not related to each other, um, are not closely related to each other at all, but they do share things that are in common. For example, both will produce cilia, and the cilia are like little hairs that will cover their bodies. So if the paramecium will use the cilia hairs to move to swim, where humans have cilia on the inside of our lungs, our intestines, which can be used for absorption. So if you'll notice here in the center of this image, it is a diagram showing you the cross section of a cilium. The cilium has the 9 bundle system, the 9 rings. And so this is a common for all cilia. And so this is a uh, structure that is housed in the directions for this is in the DNA of these organisms. And so at some point in time, there is a common ancestor between cilia of the paramecium and humans. And though controversial, there is tons of evidence to show that human evolution um, exists and that there are a lot of human ancestors that exist, which we'll cover later on in the semester. Now, evolution is made famous by Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. Darwin made two main points in his book that species showed evidence of descent with modification from common ancestors, and that natural selection is the mechanism behind descent with modification. So when Darwin published his theory of evolution, he was mainly talking about natural selection, but which we know now since Darwin, there are other forms of mechanisms that allow for evolution to take place, which we'll cover later on at the end of the semester. So Darwin's theory explained the duality of unity and diversity. And so this is an image of a young Charles Darwin. He actually didn't publish his work until he was an older man. But Darwin originally did all of his research when he was a young man on when he was the science um, observer on the HMS Beagle. And so when he returned from his voyage that spanned several years, I think 4 years, he ended up writing On the Origin of Species to explain his idea that while species can be different, but they share characteristics and they're actually related. And so to push that idea that species can be different but related, let's look at birds here. The birds, the red-tailed hawk, the European robin, the American flamingo, and the Gento penguin. So these are four different, very different species of birds, but they have some characteristics in common. Um, their wings, their feathers, the ability of flight, their claws. But they have all been modified to their environment. They have all undergone natural selection to help them better adapt and survive in their environments. So Darwin observed that individuals in a population have variability in their traits, which is heritable. So more offspring are produced that are able to survive. And because of this, because there is slight differences in our traits, because there are more offspring than the environment can support, that means that there's going to be competition between individuals. And the species that is better suited and adapted to its environment is more likely to survive and reproduce, and then pass along those traits to their offspring. So over time, more individuals in a population who have those traits that allow them to survive will slowly start to take over. And so they will become the dominant form in that population of that species. And slow, if that means that that species now is becoming slightly different than the original, to the point where um, you might not even consider it the same as the original, that is a perfect example of what we call speciation. And so that is a form of evolution, becoming adapted to your environment, being able to survive and reproduce. That is the underlying theme of evolution. So evolution occurs as the unequal reproductive success of individuals happens, meaning that the individuals that are able to survive and they're able to reproduce more, produce more offspring, and have more success. So the natural environment selects for the propagation of beneficial traits. And so this is um, Darwin's natural selection, which is it makes total sense. I think everyone understands natural selection. Let's go over another example here. Population, there's a population of beetles with varied inherited traits. You can see their different traits here, means that they have different colors. And unfortunately, some colors are more likely to camouflage into the environment compared to others. So that means that some beetles are more likely to be eaten and eliminated by their predators. And so that means that the survivors are able to undergo reproduction, to have babies, to create a new generation. And that means that at the end, there's going to be less individuals that are lightly colored. And so this change in the population, this increased frequency of the traits that allow for them to survive, is natural selection and evolution. So natural selection is not perfecting. It only allows for adaptation to the environment, to the adaptating to the environment in a way that it allows for survival. And then sometimes because of that, it may lead to unexpected adaptations that have additional function. So remember, so structure affects function. So the evolution, for example, of bat wings are an example of adaptation where not only was it used for energy regulation and temperature control, but the expanse of its arm membranes gave it the ability to fly. So this is where evolution has created um, a structure that has additional functions in the environment. And so we see this throughout all kinds of species and their similar ancestry. For example, the shared anatomy of mammalian limbs reflects the inheritance of the limb structure from a common ancestor. So you can have a common ancestor, and the evolution from that common ancestor means that to the environment or to the situation that these species are living means that they have different structures and functions. Um, Fossils and other evidence corroborate anatomical unity to support the mammalian descent with modification. And later on in the semester, when we cover evolution, you'll see we'll go over homologies and similar characteristics that are passed from ancestor to descendants. So Darwin proposed that natural selection could cause an ancestral species to give rise to two or more descendant species. Um, he proposed that adapting to the environment could lead to speciation. And so he studied the finches of the Galapagos Islands, which are made famous by Darwin. And they often show that the shared characteristics and tree-like nature of the speciation of life. So Darwin proposed that there had to be an ancestral finch, probably from the mainland of South America. And as it traveled from island to island, it slowly evolved and adapted to each island, to each habitat that it lived in.